Throughout the 2010s, the NBA would make a transition to more perimeter-oriented offense in lieu of the focus being on the traditional big man operating out of the post. As a result, we the fans received the blessing of being able to watch some of the most explosive and entertaining guard play in league history. Many point guards staked their claim as the best floor general in the league, but we all knew it was Steph Curry. However, the question as to who would come second in the pecking order was hotly debated. It felt like every week an argument could be made for whichever guy was performing the best within his last several games. One name that I expected to keep rising and eventually compete with Curry for the throne was then Wizards point guard John Wall. With insane athleticism and an all-NBA defensive team selection under his belt by the age of 24, John Wall had two-way potential that many elite guards, including Steph, simply did not possess. However, Wall would never reach that potential due to a bevy of hardships in his first decade of his NBA career. Some were out of his control, but many of his problems were self-inflicted and could have easily been avoided with better judgment. This would culminate in the team that drafted him number 1 deciding to part ways before the current season began, with 3 years left on his current contract. So let's get into why the Washington Wizards gave up on their franchise cornerstone right as he reached the tender age of 30.
Ain't shit to me, it's a walk in the park. Y'all too smart, can't talk from the heart. I got sauce and it's all for the charts.
We're going to start from the beginning, Wall's rookie season. Now, if you've already watched my NBA teammate beef video on Wall and Marcin Gortat, I'll be regurgitating much of that information, but also sprinkling in some new tidbits and going more in depth about certain topics. Otherwise, to begin, let's take things back to the year 2010, a time when David Stern was still NBA commissioner and Deron Williams had an argument for being the best point guard in basketball. In June of that year, billionaire Ted Leonsis went from minority to majority owner of the Wizards and decided it was time to hit the reset button on the roster. Their big three of Caron Butler, Gilbert Arenas, and Antoine Jamison had peaked, and by peaked I mean they collected 3 consecutive playoff exits to the Cavaliers, becoming the original LeBronto before LeBronto was a thing. Luckily for these guys, memes weren't as widespread during this time. So out went Caron Butler, Antoine Jamison, and other vets like Deshaun Stevenson, as it was time to trust the process now. Miraculously, Washington was able to secure the number 1 pick despite having the 5th best odds to do so, and everybody knew who they were taking. A freshman phenom from the University of Kentucky named John Wall, who already had his own signature arm dance that almost every Hoops fan tried to emulate at one point, even Drake. With athleticism for days and superhuman speed, John Wall was waiting in the wings to save this franchise from its consistently mediocre outputs. With Gilbert Arenas making his exodus from DC 2 months into the 2010-2011 season, the Wizards were now undeniably Wall's team. Wall would have a very solid first year that you would expect from a number 1 pick, averaging 16 and 8, but he was edged out for Rookie of the Year honors by Blake Griffin, the number 1 pick of the previous year who missed the entire season due to injury. Unfortunately, his sophomore season didn't show the growth that many people were expecting from the former Wildcat, as he put up virtually the same exact numbers as his inaugural campaign. It sounds ludicrous looking back on it now, but questions as to whether or not Wall was a bust were beginning to surface. It wasn't until the 2012-13 season where he began to prove that he was a lot closer to becoming Russell Westbrook or D. Rose than he was to becoming some inefficient shot chucker like Brandon Jennings. I hate to call Jennings out, but the numbers don't lie. I mean, how are you in the NBA shooting 27% from the field? And what made him think that it was a good idea to publicly share this cringeworthy video with the world? You know what? Never mind. Back to the topic at hand. After missing the first quarter of the season with a bum knee, Wall would return and average career highs in points per game, free throw percentage, and field goal percentage, despite playing the lowest minutes of his career until this current season. He cited Emeka Okafor as the catalyst that was responsible for the shift in his playing style. The veteran Okafor laid into him after a 1-point home loss to the Pistons, where Wall was benched. Wall would admit that his youthful immaturity got the best of him before Okafor set him straight. And from that point on, the point guard averaged 22.7 points per game, 8 assists, with a true shooting percentage of 56.4 and a 40% assist rate. And oh yeah, he was given Bradley Beal as a partner in the backcourt. Days before the 2013-14 season began, Emeka Okafor was ruled out indefinitely due to a herniated disc in his neck. With this team already having a severe lack of quality big men, they did not have time to wait for his recovery. So the Wizards went ahead and traded Okafor and a first-round pick to the Phoenix Suns for a package that included Marcin Gortat. Once he came to DC, Washington now had a starting five of Wall, Beal, Trevor Ariza, Nene, and Gortat. The starting five at the time was one of the most well-rounded and slept-on lineups in the league, because despite not having a top 10 player on the team, all of these guys were slightly above average or better at their position. The Wizards would win 15 more games than they did in the previous season, ending the year with a 44-38 record that was good enough for 5th in the Eastern Conference. They would pull off a mild upset against the 4th seed Chicago Bulls in the first round, which gave us this epic fight between Nene and Jimmy Butler. Despite the Pacers sending the Wizards home in the next round, the general consensus was that the team had overachieved expectations in their first playoff appearance since '08. To keep this overachieving core intact, Gortat would be rewarded with a 5-year, $60 million contract in the offseason. The 2014-15 season is when I'd argue that this team prematurely peaked. John Wall made an All-NBA defensive team, Otto Porter had started contributing meaningful minutes to the rotation, and free agent addition Paul Pierce brought championship pedigree and veteran leadership to the locker room. After winning 46 games, they steamrolled the Raptors in the first round with a 4-0 sweep, setting themselves up for a matchup with the number 1 seed Atlanta Hawks. This Hawks team was one of the weaker number 1 seeds in recent memory, and Washington had an opportunity to make a statement to the basketball world that they had arrived. They were able to take Game 1 on the road, but it would be at the cost of John Wall fracturing his hand. The Wizards were still able to win another game without him, but he didn't return until Game 5, and by then it was too late. They still would have forced a Game 7 if Paul Pierce had let this beauty fly half a second earlier. I try to stay away from hypotheticals, but good luck finding a feasible argument to make that the Hawks still would have won if Wall had 5 good fingers. The Wizards' quest for a revenge tour would unfortunately be stifled the following season as Beal missed almost 30 games with injuries to his shoulder, leg, and pelvis. I refer to this as the lost season because all of their core pieces put up better numbers than they did in the prior season, but losing Beal as well as their new starting forward Markieff Morris to injuries denied Washington from their 3rd consecutive playoff appearance. Heading into next season, the team decided to part ways with head coach Randy Whitman, who I actually liked, in favor of Scott Brooks. And this is when the first subliminal shot by Gortat was sent Wall's way. When asked about the coaching change, the Polish big man opened up about how miserable he was during the prior season, and called out Whitman for playing favorites, stating to reporters, "Our new coach doesn't have to do anything. He just has to respect everyone, from the first guy to the last guy. If John Wall does something bad, he has to yell at him the same way he would yell at the last guy on the team. Everything will be fine." While this is more of an indictment on Randy Whitman, it establishes Gortat's frustration that Wall was able to get away with not playing basketball the right way. Nonetheless, this team kept rolling and finished the regular season 1 game shy of 50 wins. But things weren't as rosy as they appeared. For every win, there was some sort of passive-aggressive comment or action being made, like Beal's intense side-eye of Wall after a victory against the Celtics. Or when Beal suffered a shoulder injury, John would walk right past him as everybody else on the team came to Beal's aid. Wall would admit that they had a tendency to dislike each other on the court. He also demanded that Beal improve his game now that he was getting paid max contract money. Most of this flew under the radar because, of course, they achieved their best record of the Wall era, and number 2 had the best individual season of his career, averaging 23, 10, and 4. In the first round, they were able to avenge their 2015 playoffs loss to the Atlanta Hawks, but this series lasted 6 games when it shouldn't have taken more than 5, if you look at how bare that Atlanta Hawks team had become. In the conference semis, they took on the number 1 seed Boston Celtics, another number 1 seed that was very vulnerable. Going against a team whose best player was a 5'9" point guard with arguably the worst defensive skills in the NBA should have been like taking candy from a baby. In perhaps Wall's greatest individual career moment, he hit a game-sealing 3 to send the series to a Game 7. Yet all of the Wizards' energy seemed to be used up that night. Looking back on Game 7, all I can remember is how gassed John Wall looked in the fourth quarter, disappearing down the stretch. This team had all of the requisite pieces to at least challenge LeBron and the Cavs for representing the Eastern Conference in the finals, but they kept coming up short. In the offseason, Wall wasn't afraid to make it known what upgrade he wanted the Wizards to make, asking for a swap of Otto Porter Jr. and Paul George. Porter Jr. was an improving young player, but lacked the strength needed to defend big bodies like LeBron James, and lacked some of the speed that PG-13 could bring to the table. Wall emphasized the need to have 3 stars on the roster if this team wanted to take things to the next level. While many players would feel the same way, it was completely disrespectful and unnecessary of Wall to say this publicly. If you wanted Paul George, make that request known to the front office in private, not in the press. And to explicitly say that Otto was the one holding the team back, then double down on those comments was baffling. You don't throw your own teammate under the bus like that when you're supposed to be the leader. Rather than recognizing this, the front office would reward Wall with a supermax contract in the off-season, and also give Otto Porter a max contract of his own, effectively committing to a nucleus of Wall, Beal, and Porter as their franchise cornerstones. The 2017-18 season was really the team's chance to see how far this trio could take them, and this is when the drama would start to peak. In a January game against the Mavericks, John Wall and JJ Barea started chirping back and forth over God knows what. After the game, Wall called Barea a midget. Barea's response was casual but also cut deep, as he said, "Now I have somebody in the NBA that I don't like. That's my first. I don't like him at all now. But I don't think his teammates like him either, so it's nothing new for him." Ouch. So I guess those Rolex watches Wall bought the team for Christmas weren't enough.
I was just kidding, it was really Rolex. Wow.
These comments from Barea were made only a day after a failed team meeting allegedly took place in the Washington locker room. Barea's criticism seemed to prove true when Wall would undergo knee surgery at the end of that month. This sidelined him for several weeks. The Wizards responded to his absence by winning 8 of their next 10 games, and his teammates took the opportunity to throw some petty shots in their floor general's direction. Suddenly, the team's new motto was "Everybody Eats," as Beal felt the ball movement on offense had improved immensely. But what really set John Wall off was Marcin Gortat's tweet about a great team victory, with team in quotes. So Wall decided to return the public slander by taking things to ESPN, where he demanded that his center put some respect on his name. Gortat tried to explain himself out of it by praising Wall as someone who could be the best point guard in the NBA, but that meant he had to play the right way and look to pass to his teammates more. In a first-round matchup, the Wizards were pitted against the Toronto Raptors, a team they had swept 3 years prior. But the tables had turned in their rematch. The Wizards were older, injured, and couldn't stand each other. So they took their frustration out on Toronto. They were sent home after 6 games, but not before we were able to view an arguing Gortat and Wall on the bench, while Beal covered his face in frustration. If it wasn't clear by now, this team had reached its ceiling, and a major facelift was needed. As always, the team sided with the superstar, so Gortat was sent packing for LA in exchange for Austin Rivers. Stephen A. Smith would reveal on his radio show that the rapport between Gortat and Wall allegedly reached the point of no return after the infamous team meeting. See, Scott Brooks, due to his dislike of confrontation, was a coach who allowed his players to constantly switch off screens when defending the other team. As a result, John Wall was able to avoid his defensive assignments, leaving Gortat to guard much smaller and faster players. After calling out number 2 for repeatedly leaving him on an island, Wall ripped into Gortat and MF'd him to death, which I assume just means cursed him out. This is when the Polish Hammer wanted nothing to do with Wall any longer. Despite the initial denial, the truth would come out once the two were separated. He's quoted as saying, "There were tensions in the locker room, especially in Washington with our leader. Can't hide it. We didn't like each other, but those tensions were only between me and him." Heading into the 2018-19 season, the Wizards got off to an abysmal 5-11 start, with reports of continued dissension plaguing the organization, which gave Gortat a sense of vindication, as he felt that this proved he was not the real cancer in the locker room. Additionally, questions about Wall's work ethic arose after a Team USA photo depicted him looking several pounds overweight and like he had just woken up from a fireball-induced hangover. Things were so bad that the Wizards' Twitter account ended up taking down the photo. Stephen A. Smith would also add fuel to the fire by calling out the point guard for spending too much time partying at Rose Bar, a DC lounge, than he did studying the playbook. Wall didn't even deny that he was guilty as charged, hopping on Instagram Live to sarcastically brag about his off-the-court exploits as he sat back in a hot tub. 32 games into the regular season, Wall would suffer a heel injury that required season-ending surgery. This was compounded by him slipping and falling in his home weeks later, which ruptured his left Achilles tendon, adding 12 more months to his recovery timeline. After the season concluded, GM Ernie Grunfeld was let go after 15 years and replaced by Tommy Shepard, who was already working for the team. During this time, Wall continued his immature decision-making by continuing to throw up gang signs, partying, and even playing a game of spades when ESPN was trying to interview him. If you're Tommy Shepard and trying to establish a culture shift under your new regime, what kind of message does it send to your team when your highest paid player is an out-of-shape, often injured, gang sign-throwing miscreant who has little respect for his teammates and coaches? Therefore, John Wall was sent packing to Houston in exchange for Russell Westbrook, a high-energy and high-character replacement at the point guard position, leaving us to wonder, where did Wall go wrong? One of my biggest criticisms for John Wall is that despite his impressive 2016-17 season, he never really got better after that 2013 to 2015 period. His jump shot is still broken, he doesn't play well in the clutch, and his defensive impact significantly diminished after he made that one All-NBA defensive team. When I see players like Wall who are super athletic but mediocre defenders, that immediately tells me that there's a discipline issue. You have all the physical tools to stop the man you're guarding, so the only thing preventing you from doing so is your mentality and dedication. What Wall needed was another veteran teammate like Emeka Okafor who was going to keep him in line and wasn't afraid to call out the star of the team. And do you think it's a coincidence that Wall's only All-NBA defensive team selection occurred during the same season that he played with Paul Pierce, an NBA champion? One of the most important things to grasp about life is that life is a team game. So when you don't have a steadying presence around to keep your head on straight, whether it be a teammate, coworker, family, or friend, you will backslide into bad habits. And by my estimation, Wall is someone who clearly surrounds himself with enablers, and that includes owner Ted Leonsis. Professional sports owners have an unhealthy tendency to fall head over heels for their franchise players. Whether that's due to them recognizing said athlete as a lucrative asset to sell tickets and therefore increase their revenue, or if they just genuinely form a fondness, this dynamic rarely yields positive results. Some examples of this phenomenon include Dan Snyder and RG3, and Arthur Blank and Michael Vick. The fact that nobody was around to tell John Wall to get his fat you-know-what in shape, stay away from the gang affiliations, and treat those around him with respect is disheartening. When this enabling continues for long enough, it can get to the point where the athlete is too stubborn and toxic to listen to anyone until they begin self-destructing, which is what we witnessed with John Wall. When I watched Wizards games during the middle part of the last decade, I was convinced that I was watching a transcendent legend in the making who would one day become the best point guard in basketball. But sadly, that would never come to fruition because for every step forward, he would take 2 steps back. Sitting at the age of 30 on one of the worst teams in the league, the future is not looking too bright for the former Kentucky Wildcat. As a Washington fan, it hurt me to my core having to see John Wall wear another team's jersey. But ultimately, parting ways with Wall was probably the best decision that the franchise has made in several years. Nonetheless, you will always have a special place in the hearts of Wizards fans everywhere, as a symbol of hope that was able to lead this team back to the playoffs. Thank you, and good luck, John Wall. Thank you for watching. Feel free to check out my other NBA beef videos. Also, please check out my NFL investigation video into the Deshaun Watson sexual assault allegations. I worked my butt off on this video, but also really enjoyed making it. Show me some love if you can, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. This is CT, and I'm signing out.